We're going to begin on the section of the sheet that begins before speaking of the interior prayer. Notice when Teresa says that, she's identifying prayer with the interior life. Right? So that's prayer with the big P, the interior life. And she says, before speaking of the interior life, that is of prayer, I shall speak of certain things which those who attempt to walk along the way of prayer must of necessity practice. In other words, what we're going to talk about now is an essential part of the life of prayer. And we're going to talk about these three things, which she mentions, and she says again, you may be sure that anyone who cannot set up the pieces in a game of chess will never be able to play the game well. If you can't even put the pieces on the board and know where they go, you're not going to be able to play the game. And she's going to suggest that detachment and loving each other, that's just setting up the pieces. And how can you play the game? Well, humility is the way to play the game. So those three things, and the text I've already read to you, but I'll read it again to focus for our attention here. There are three things that I will explain at some length. It is essential that we should understand how very important they are to us in helping us to preserve that peace, both inward and exward and outward, which the Lord so earnestly recommended to us. One of these is love for each other. The second, detachment from all created things. The third, true humility, which, although I put it last, is the most important of the three and embraces all the rest. We're going to talk about poverty first, or detachment, and then loving each other, and lastly about humility. I want to say that these three things that she's talking about have been singled out in our tradition as being the key elements in the journey to God. Basically, what we've got here are the realities behind the three vows of religious life. In other words, the religious their life grew out of the early Christian way of living, and it was singled out as the way to live consecrated life, these three important essentials. So while the language may be a bit different, we're talking about essential things which became embodied in religious life, not only to be lived in religious life, but as to be witnessed to the whole of the Christian community, to be lived in their own life as well. So let's start with the virtue of poverty is a personal commitment to a way of life centred on our total self-giving to God. If we raise an issue of poverty in a discussion with people immediately think of things, not having enough to live on. Poverty is being without. What we have here is not that sort of poverty. That really we're talking about a personal commitment to Jesus to live in a certain way. And that certain way is not to let anything else get in the way of our love for the Lord. I think when young people are engaged and married, they would say, I love you and I'll do anything for you, and they mean that. But that's what love is about. And when we talk about detachment from created things, we're not saying they're bad. We're just saying we're not going to let them get in the way of giving ourselves completely to God. And Teresa puts it in this way, care nothing for created things, but embrace the Creator alone. We've got nothing against created things, but we want to go beyond the created things to the Creator. And how silly it would be if we let God's creation stand in the way of going to God. As Augustine said, late have I loved you. You were within, and I was in the world outside myself. He was caught up with the things of creation, but he needed to find the Creator. The blessing of giving ourselves wholly to him and keeping nothing for ourselves. That's what we're talking about when we talk about poverty in Teresa. It's wanting to give oneself wholly to God. And she says, detach your heart from all things. Seek God and you will find him. This is really what we find in the gospel. You can't serve God and mammon. Where your treasure is, there is your heart. And if Jesus is our treasure, then we're not going to let things get in the way. As Augustine said, you've made us for yourself, O Lord. Until we rest in you, we're not going to find perfect rest at all. So the virtue of poverty, a personal commitment to a way of life centred around self-giving to God. Now, Teresa doesn't actually use those words, that's my title words, but the reality is clearly there in the words that I have quoted. The importance of the virtue of poverty. I'll read this section, it's a bit long. I cannot understand how humility exists. And remember, she said humility is the most important and embraces all the rest. But she says here, I cannot understand how humility exists or can exist without love, or love without humility. And it is impossible for these two virtues to exist save where there is a great detachment from all created things. In other words, unless we give ourselves wholly to the Lord, these other things don't necessarily come into play. So she's suggesting that the important thing is focus on the Lord and don't let created things stand between. If the rule of poverty is truly kept, both chastity and all the other virtues are fortified much better than by the most sumptuous edifices. Right? She's sort of saying we don't get support from all the buildings that we put up, even though they have a place. But really, it's in this practice of detachment that we need to find it. I think that it's important. I mean, poverty is a thing in our life that has quite a different meaning to what we're talking about here. And it's loving the Creator rather than getting caught up with the created things. Even though, and Teresa pointed out explicitly, we do have to get caught up with created things in the life that we lead and to fulfil the duties of our way of life. But don't let them get in the way of our relationship with Jesus. And of course the way to do that is what we talked about in recollection. In other words, to make our life a union of love so that all the things that we do, all our use of the created things, are used positively, but they're not in any way standing between us and the Lord. They become the vehicles of our communication with the Lord. The third thing there is the totality required by the virtue of poverty. And we've perhaps seen that already. But she says, the important point is that we should be absolutely resolved to give it, the soul, to him for his own, and should empty it so that he may take out and put in just what he likes, as he would with something that is his own. But that's what we want our heart to be, empty of things so that it can be full of God. As he refuses to force our will, he takes what we give him, but does not give himself wholly until he sees that we are giving ourselves wholly to him. The author of The Cloud of Unknowing, another important Catholic mystical book, says that God does not ask for our help, he asks for us. In other words, it's the giving of ourselves, not just doing a bit in order to help. This is certain and is of such importance, I often remind you of it. So this is a reality that we need to have in our life, and perhaps it's something that we perhaps haven't recognised how important it is. Never try to sustain yourselves by human artifices, or you will die of hunger, and rightly so. Keep your eyes fixed upon your spouse. It is for him to sustain you. So the important thing that's being made there is that we need to be dependent on the Lord. And if we're dependent on the Lord, the Creator, then we will use created things in the way they need to be used, in the way our responsibilities make us use them. But they won't become the obstacles between ourselves and God. She says, live the life of poverty. In other words, it's not just something to talk about, it's something that we need to live. She's already said that it's not so much what you have, but how you relate to what you have. In other words, that's the thing. You might be a much richer person than somebody else in the room, but you may be more detached than another person. Right? So it's not the richness of the thing, the reality itself. It's the attitude of the heart. And you can be a well-off person that is detached, and you can be a very poor person who is not detached from the things that they have. Just to read on a bit further, as regards our house, our clothes, our speech, and which is more important, our thoughts. It's one thing to go without material things, but what we're talking about here is in our thoughts. It's the desire that is in our heart. You can sort of be poor, but all you think about is being rich. You know, that you live in poverty and you put up with it, as it were. But it's what's in the heart that is the important thing. For the love of the Lord, then, I beg you, now that the rule of poverty is less perfectly observed as regards outward things, let us strive to observe it inwardly. So we don't put our desires on things that we want, as it were. We are become, and she says it somewhere, content with what we have received. And that's going to be a continuing theme for Teresa, just to be ready to accept whatever it is that the Lord gives us. We'll see that when we come to talk about humility in a short while. Poverty is a commitment of the heart which does find expression in external things. She says, for although I professed poverty, I was not only without poverty of spirit, but my spirit was devoid of all restraints. In other words, she was a religious and she made the vows that needed to be made, but in her heart she really wasn't detached. And Meister Eckhart, a famous spiritual writer, said there was nowhere rest except in the detached heart, because it's what we are in the heart that really is who we are. And the final thing on the page there, the view of poverty, the virtue of poverty, gives the freedom to be in the world of creative things without being distracted by them. In other words, we can use creative things. We can be in the midst of riches, as it were. But if we have the spirit of detachment and poverty, then we're not going to be led astray by those things. We have the freedom to use them without being bound by them. I haven't quoted St John of the Cross much, but he has a wonderful saying about the bird that can be held down in captivity by a slender thread or a heavy rope. It doesn't matter whether it's a slender thread or a heavy rope, the bird is still held captive. And the point that's being made is that we might sort of say, well, I've given up everything and, I'm obviously detached. But you could become attached to very minor things. John Cassian, who wrote in the 4th century, said that people give up everything to join the monastery, and then they go to town about somebody handling their book or sitting in their place in chapel. They're attached to all these little things when they've given up all the great things. So we need to have that freedom, and unless we have that freedom, we are in danger of focusing too much on the creatures and not enough on the Creator. And the final point, or second final point, she talks about money and honour. I think it's obvious when we're talking about being detached. Money is an obvious thing to be detached from. But honour is something that really preoccupied her. And I think it was clear in Father Greig's talk yesterday that the convents in which he lived was very much caught up with honour. Who your father was and what distinguished family you belonged to. And I think that when we talk about detachment and created things, we tend to think of objects, but it's also those things in our life wanting to be loved by others, for example. And that was a big thing for Teresa. She wanted to be loved by others, and she had to fight that. Wanting to get on in the world, the prestige of getting this honour or that honour. Now, it's not to say that we have to knock back all honours, because sometimes in your job you're supposed to go on and get these things, but it's being detached from them, and I think that's the thing that she's talking about. And she says too about, she says, if poverty is embraced for God's sake alone, no one has to be pleased but God. In other words, you don't have to worry about, am I pleasing other people? You just have to worry about pleasing God. She says under that same point, those who worry too much about the alms they are likely to be given will find that sooner or later this bad habit will lead them to go and ask for something which they do not need, and perhaps from someone who needs it more than they do. In other words, if we become conscious, I have to have that, that's something that's important, and you're likely to go to somebody and get it, and that person may need it more than you do. So it's that freedom to be without. It's the freedom to find happiness wherever you are. That the rest that we have in God doesn't depend on all the things around us. It's a situation that is within our heart. And the last point there, which I think is given a little spot there, but it's perhaps the most important point of all, which is detachment from self. It is here that true humility can enter. For this virtue, that is humility, and that of detachment from self, I think always go together. They are two sisters who are inseparable. You must embrace that. What she means by detachment from self is detachment from all the things you want. Your own comfort, being able in your life to deny yourself. Jesus said, if anyone will come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross and follow me. St. Peter didn't deny himself. He denied Jesus and therefore didn't take up what might have been the fourth cross on Calvary if he had acknowledged that he was a disciple of Jesus. So this detachment from self are our own wants, our own comfort. We live in a very comfortable society. If you travel to Asia or other places in the world, you'd sort of say, I don't think I'd like to live here. They don't have the comforts that we have. Now, they can become a burden to us. To be free, hard to be free from our little wants here and there. And that's the mortification. I mentioned earlier that it's prayer and the practice of virtue. And the practice of virtue means remoulding our way of life. Perhaps better, transforming our way of life. And we do that by self-denial. But we have a time in Lent which was built around that very concept that we have to deny ourselves in order to gain the strength to be able to be independent of these passions and wants that can be so much part of our life. So that detachment from self is really a very important thing. And I mentioned earlier, I was quoting the mystic Ruysbroek, a Flemish mystic, the journey from God is a journey from selfishness to selflessness. In other words, we begin in our life as being selfish. If you look at children, they're very selfish. They only want what's good for them. Now, as we grow, we have to come to grips with that tendency, and we have to become less selfish. And no matter where we are, how far we are along the journey, that selfishness can still creep in. So when she talks about detachment from self, she's really talking about that whole transformation of our life, that along with prayer are the two supports of our deep relationship with God. I'd like to go on and just do the next section before we have a little break, and that is her emphasis on love for each other. Remember the Lord's words, by this shall all know that you are my disciples, that you have love one for another. So really what we're talking about here is at the very heart of our faith. I think this is behind the vow of chastity. We often think of the vow of chastity in terms of sexuality, controlling our sexuality or abstaining from sexuality if we take a vow of celibacy. But really, our tradition links sexuality with love. When we liken things to marriage, we so often think of the expression of sexuality, but marriage is about deep love. And so when we talk about things like sexuality, we're talking about love, and that's the important thing. She makes an important distinction. There are two kinds of love which I am describing. The one is purely spiritual, and apparently has nothing to do with sensuality or the tenderness of our nature, either of which might stain its purity. This is an ideal, as it were. But this is the sort of love that you've got to have in loving somebody who's unlovable. Somebody who you think, what can be loved in that person? In other words, it's not a love that is drawn by something out there. It's a love that begins in the heart and reaches out. In St John's Gospel, we have God, in the first letter, God is love. And then in the Gospel, as the Father has loved me, I have loved you. Love one another as I have loved you. So the important thing that's being made here is that we've got to be loving independently of whoever is out there or whatever they have done. That's her first type of love. The second type of love, she says, the other, is also spiritual. So she's not going to put this down. She's saying that this is a spiritual love too. But mingled with it are our sensuality and weakness. Yet it is a worthy love which, as between relatives and friends, seems lawful. Right? So she's saying that there can be personal feelings involved here, that we can be drawn out by people, but as long as we do that carefully, then it can be a lawful love. When she talks to her sisters, she says, if nothing else, have the second one. But really, what we want is for you to have the first one. And I think that that's what the Lord is asking for us in the Gospels, when it says, love your enemies, do good to those who persecute you. In other words, it's not what they're doing, it's the love that comes from you. Jesus prayed on Calvary, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. That as he was in the midst of all that was happening, he was able to make that prayer. So human friendship, as she says, if we exercise this love with moderation and discretion, it's wholly meritorious. Because what seems to us sensuality is turned into virtue. In other words, we've got to work at that relationship to make it a virtuous relationship, not just one that's there on the grounds of mutual attraction. However, more important, in number 3, is the essence of spiritual love. This, as I have said, is love without any degree whatsoever of self-interest. All that this soul wishes and desires is to the soul it loves. I might have that written wrongly. And desires is to see the soul it loves enriched with blessings from heaven. In other words, in this relationship, what's important is not what the person's getting out of it, but that they might help that other person to grow in their relationship with God. And that's what we would expect from religious community, from parish community, from anywhere where believers are gathered together, that there is a love that enables one to reach out for the other. She says, those who love in this way are much fonder of giving than receiving. There are many people who love because they like to get something back. What she's talking about is a love that is willing to give and not focus on receiving. You might remember in prayer, Teresa says that when we go to prayer, we should go to give rather than receive. We don't always receive, or we don't think we always receive. We do, but it's not something we can recognise. But we can always go to give ourselves to the Lord. And I think that's what she's talking about here. Let us not allow our will to be the slave of any, save of him who bought it with his blood. That's what we are trying to do. And the next point makes it clear that Jesus himself is the model of this love. And we can only love as Jesus loves if we are intimately related to Jesus. That's the whole point of Teresa's journey, that we come together and we are able to do things because of the love that we have with the Lord. I repeat once more that this love is a similitude and copy of that which was born for us by the good lover of Jesus. She talks about imitating the captain of love, Jesus and our God. How true and genuine will be the love of a sister who can bring profit to everyone by sacrificing her own profits to that of the rest. That's the self-detachment that we were talking about just a little bit earlier. Being able to be in something for the service of the other rather than from what we get out of ourselves. She says, and it's not on the sheet, there is nothing, however annoying, that cannot be easily borne by those who have love for each other. A lot of what Teresa talks about is in terms of the religious community, but I think an exact copy of that is the family. When we look at the family, all of the conflicts that can happen in religious community can happen in the family. To exercise a love that is not based on how well everybody's doing what we think they should be doing, but on a love that is coming from our heart. So while this may be given in the context of religious community, it's something that is important in the family or whenever believers get together. They want to exercise this love, and not only believers, because we want to exercise that love for everybody. I just wanted to focus on the love of Jesus for a moment, because in the Gospel of St John, as I mentioned, God is love, Jesus brings that love to us, and we are to walk in love. That in the Gospels, the thing that's put to us is that we've got to act. Be merciful as your Heavenly Father is merciful. Have compassion as your Heavenly Father has compassion. So what we're saying here in the light and through Jesus, that what is in the divine life is made manifest to us in Jesus. And as we are drawn to share in the life of Jesus, we are drawn to share in the divine life itself. And therefore what flows out from us to others is what begins in the divine life itself. Now this might seem to be a great ideal, but we're seeing in Teresa someone who lived that ideal. And while St Teresa is a great person, I'm sure there have been many people within her Carmelite family who have lived that ideal. And there are many people within our Catholic community who have and who still do live in that very loving way. She makes a helpful point there where she talks about the fact it's helpful to be friends with the friends of God. I think that's why religious life grew up in community. It was being part of a community that we're all wanting to be lovers of Jesus. And I think that's part of our parish community or any Catholic community, keeping the company of those who love Jesus. And I believe that good company is good. It's a sort of a maxim of our society, but it's even more important for us. And she has an example there, and I think it's a good one, and I've seen it practiced by people who are not religious at all. If one should be cross with another because of some hasty word, the matter must at once be put right, and you must retake yourself to earnest prayer. The same applies to the harbouring of any grudge, or to party strife, or to the desire to be the greatest, or to any nice point concerning your honour. First of all, put it aside. That's the thing that we've got to do. But she offers another thing. Often commend to God any sister who is at fault, and strive for your own part to practice the virtue which is the opposite to her fault with great perfection. In other words, it's not just a question of confronting the person and telling them that they're doing wrong, but in your own life to live as radically and as well as you can that point in which the other might be failing. I'm interested in a movement that fosters character in children, the Suzuki musical movement, and it was founded by a Dr. Suzuki. And in his life, he records how he had a young man come to live with him and with his family, and he could see that the young man was going astray. So he called together the family and pointed out that they needed to live the reality that they wanted this young man to understand and practice. And they did that, and it worked. And I think that's what Teresa is saying here, that it's our life that can do it. She goes on to say, the habit of performing some conspicuously virtuous action through seeing it performed by another is one which very easily takes root. If we see other people doing it, there's a maxim that people's lives are changed by people's lives. In other words, if we live it, other people will see what it's about. And of course that's the way, the basic way that we spread the gospel. For considerate treatment of them and the sisters, that is perfect love. When we look at the family and the love that's demanded there, that can be perfect love. So you can see that those 2 points, Teresa says that they're just putting the pieces on the board, haven't even begun to play yet, but they're basic things that we need to have as we enter more fully into the journey. So I'd like to suggest we might just pause for 2 or 3 minutes again. I invite you just to share your own thoughts and your own response to the people around you. I'd just like to turn now to the third sheet that you have there, which is entitled Humility. And of course Teresa has said that she sees this as embracing the other 2. She's saying that these 3 points are like the structure of our relationship with God. If you want to work on these 3 points, you can work on them all the way in your life, because they can never really be fully depthed, as it were. And wherever we are on the journey, these are areas that we need to focus on. And that comes through particularly when she talks about humility. And of course she begins by talking about the fact that the model of humility is Jesus himself. It is very important, in my opinion, to practice this virtue. In other words, to try to obtain from our Lord that true humility of which he is the source. We need to bring to mind the text in Philippians chapter 2, where the Word humbles himself and becomes obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. So Jesus himself is the model of the humility that we're looking for here. I often need to remind people that if we go back before Jesus to the ancient Greek and Latin writers, you'll find some wonderful insights into humility, into being humble. And that's good humility, but it's not the humility that comes from our relationship with Jesus and our relationship with God. It doesn't make it bad, it's just it means that in our revelation in Jesus, something new has been given to us with regards to humility. She goes on to say, yes, this adorable Saviour, who is everything to us, is the channel by which every good comes to us. He will himself deign to teach you. Study his life. There is no more perfect model. We haven't dwelt on the fact that we should study the scriptures, but really it is there that we come to know Jesus. The old maxim of Jerome, ignorance of the scriptures is ignorance of Christ, means that we do. And Teresa talks about meditation, and that's what meditation is. It's reflection on the scriptures, not exclusively, but certainly they have an important role. And it's there that we understand what Christian humility is about, as it is exemplified for us by Jesus. She goes on, we should set our eyes on Christ, our good, from whom we shall learn true humility. Looking at the life of Jesus, the focus of the life of Jesus was really his Father. I came from the Father into the world, and I leave the world, and I go to the Father. I've come not to do my will, but the will of him who sent me. And in the garden, Father, if it be possible, let this chalice pass from me, but let not my will, but thine be done. So it was by looking to someone above himself, as it were, that enabled Jesus to live the life of humility that he did. And we, in looking to Jesus, that's the focus of our life, which affects the way we live with others. I often use, in talking about humility, a symbol or an image that comes from the Orient. It's not a Christian image, but the image is that the mountain lords it over the molehill, but both are dwarfed by the stars. That if you take the mountain as the point of reference, the molehills are way down there. But if you take the stars as the point of reference, the distance to the stars is so great that the distance between the mountain and the molehill is absolutely insignificant. And to apply that to our Christian humility if we take the mountain ourselves as the point of reference, we can look down on all the people around us that really are molehills, right? And we can look at our great abilities that we have. And it may be true that I may be a mountain in terms of this particular thing and you may be lesser. But if we take the stars, if we take God as the point of reference, then the distance between us is really nothing. We are all sinners before God. So by keeping our eyes fixed on the Lord, we're reminded of that. I remember when I was hearing confessions 53 years ago, or being taught to hear confessions, and the priest there said, the priest that thinks he's doing well will be hard on those that come to him. The priest that thinks he's a mountain will say to people, well, you know, I'm keeping it, why can't you? But the priest who recognises that he's a sinner will welcome those who come to him as fellow sinners. And you often find priests that have been drunkards and had all sorts of problems. They're the people that people come to, right? Because I think they have that humility to recognise that we are all sinners before God, that we are all creatures before the Creator. So I think that image brings out of us that really by keeping our eyes fixed on the Jesus, who is, as Teresa says, the model of humility, then that has effects of how we relate to each other. And it helps to overcome that point that I said is the worst thing about our journey, that self-centeredness, that wanting to be, to do it our way, as I said, which we'll talk about a little further down. So I think that's a good image from the East. I'd like to mention just another thing from the scriptures that I think relates to what Teresa is saying. We have the incident of the parable in the scriptures about the prodigal son. And in the context that it's given, it's said quite explicitly it's being preached to the Pharisees. And of course the Pharisees were Jesus' principal opponents. And there was one particular thing that was very much at the heart of the conflict between them. And I think the story of the prodigal brings that out. And when Jesus said there was a man that had two sons, one who went off and squandered himself, and the other one that stayed home and did all that he should have done, the Pharisees said, yes, we identify with the one who stayed at home. But he was not the one, in the end, who was accepted by God. The one who was accepted was the one who said, Father, I have sinned against you. I am not worthy to be your son. I always get emotional when I think about that. But the point being made is it's not what we do. It's having that acknowledgement that we are sinners. And that's what the humility, I think, is about. So what Jesus was saying was that really, yes, the son that stayed at home, he did all the right things, but it made him arrogant and judgmental of others. It was right to do that, to do what he did, but he lacked that was in the heart. And the story of the Pharisee and the publican. Pharisee goes into the temple and says, you know, I've been a good man, I don't commit adultery, and I'm better than this publican that's here. And the Pharisee said, yes, well, he's a good Pharisee, we identify with him. But the publican says, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. And he is the one that is accepted. And there's a story that's told in Luke chapter 17, verse 7. And it's a story about a servant that goes into the field. And he does all the work he has to do, and he comes home. And Jesus says, the master doesn't say, sit down, I'll get your dinner. No, he gets the master's dinner, because that's what the servant is supposed to do. And Jesus said, when you have done all that you should do, say, I am an unworthy servant. And that's the humility, I think, that Teresa is talking about. The second point there is about self-knowledge. As I see it, we shall never succeed in knowing ourselves unless we seek to know God. Let us think of his greatness and come back to our baseness. By looking at his purity, we shall see our foulness. By meditation upon his humility, we shall see how far we are from being humble. By looking at God, one becomes acutely aware of one's own sinfulness and is thus opened wholly to God. And sometimes we find that sort of language a bit repulsive. I think somewhere Teresa refers to herself as a worm in terms of this context of humility. If we were to just attack this question intellectually, without any religious motive, I think I could convince you quite easily that compared to the great love that God has given to us, really we haven't responded as fully as we could have done. Right? No, I don't think anybody would deny that. But that's just looking at it intellectually. What we're looking at with Teresa is somebody who had a deep experience of that. And as they have that deep experience, what's happening is that they're struggling for words to sort of express just how little they are when they come to this unique experience of God. And so they pick up words like foulness and baseness and being like a worm, which seems to us to seem strange. But it's coming out of that experience of recognising who God is and who we are. And that's the self-knowledge that we're talking about here. I think I might have mentioned, but the cloud of unknowing, when it talks about the highest levels of contemplation, we don't see ourselves as sinners. He says we see ourselves as a lump of sin. You know, that when we get to that stage, that experience, then we recognise that our self-knowledge, we are creatures before the Creator. And I think to understand her words, we probably need to have the experience that she had. And it's a common experience among the great spiritual people of our time. So self-knowledge here is who we are in relationship to God. We can come to some self-knowledge by psychological means, finding out about our emotions and the sort of person we are, and that can be a healthy thing to do. But that's not the self-knowledge we're talking about here. We're talking about who we are in relationship to God. And when we take God as the model, then I think we realise how little we are. She says their self-knowledge is indispensable even for those whom God takes to dwell in the same mansion with himself. In other words, when you get to the closest possible union, you still need that self-knowledge. And as the author of The Cloud says, we just feel like a lump of sin confronted with that experience of God. However, nothing else, however elevated, perfects the soul, which must never seek to forget its own nothingness. Yet let humility be always at work, like the bee at the honeycomb, or all will be lost. So humility, something that's so important in our journey. She talks about humility in prayer, and basically what she's saying, that when we come to prayer, remember who it is that you're praying to and who it is that is praying. In other words, getting the relationship right. One of the fathers of the church used to say that just saying, I'm going to pray, captures the reality of prayer, that there is a God to whom we should pray, and that we are creatures who should pray to that God. For humility is the principal virtue which must be practiced by those who pray. When you speak, as it is right for you to do, with so great a word, it is well that you should think of who it is that you are addressing and what you yourself are. And of course, when Teresa comes to recognise how little she is in relationship to God, then that's the framework within which she then reaches out in love to God. She now comes back to the game of chess, right? You had to set up the pieces. Well, the first two things have set up the pieces. How do you play the game? Well, if you're not a chess person, the aim of the game of chess is to check the king. In other words, put the king in a situation where it can't move. And of the pieces on the board that are most effective in bringing about that reality, that the queen is the most effective one in doing it. And she says the queen is humility. There is no queen who can beat this king as well as humility can. For humility brought him down from heaven into the Virgin's womb, and with humility we can draw him into our souls by a single hair. This king does not allow himself to be taken, except by those who surrender wholly to him. I think that's very moving. So the queen, remember the queen, she conquers not by force, but by surrender. And the last point there, and we're getting to the end of our time, It's not my will, but the will of God. Reflect that true humility consists to a great extent in being ready for what the Lord desires to do with you and happy that he should do it. In other words, we want to do it our way. We'd rather have this position or that position, but no, we've got to be ready to do what the Lord wants. True humility consists with our being satisfied with what is given us. This presupposes the acknowledgement that it is the Lord who has the right to guide our lives. The Lord is our captain, and the soldier must be ready to respond to his captain's command. Reflect that true humility consists to a great extent in being ready for what the Lord desires to do with you and happy that he should do it, and in always considering yourself unworthy to be called his servants. So if you look back in the scriptures, you've got people who were willing to do what the Lord wanted. Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son. Mary, be it done unto me according to your word. Jesus, if it be possible, let this chalice pass from me, but let not my will, but thine be done. So the attitude of humility means that we're ready to serve wherever it is that the Lord wants us to serve. And I think she captures that wonderfully well in that last quote there. If contemplation and mental and vocal prayer and tending the sick and serving in the house and working at even the lowest task are of service to the guest who comes to stay with us and to eat and take his recreation with us, what should it matter to us if we do one of these rather than the other? In other words, God calls us all in different ways. It's a quote now that it's not on your sheet, but she says it's very important to realise that God does not lead us all by the same road, right? But we are all open to the fullness of that road. But we're called to different ways, and we need to be happy with those different ways, because whatever it is that you do, you can go all the way to God in that situation if you are willing to do it. She says that all should be contemplatives is impossible, because God doesn't give that gift to everybody. And those of us who aren't would be greatly discouraged if we did not grasp the truth that contemplation is something that is given by God. And as it is not necessary for salvation, and God does not ask it of us before he gives us his reward, we must suppose that anyone else will require it. In other words, we don't have to be contemplatives. We may be the person that opens the door and greets the visitors, as Teresa did in her convent. But it's by being ready to do what it is that the Lord calls us to do that we actually have this humility. So I'd like to suggest that this humility is really important. I mentioned yesterday about the temptation to Adam and Eve. You will be like God. In other words, we want to be like God. We want to do it our way rather than another way. We can say that Jesus didn't want to die on the cross. If it be possible, let this chalice pass from me. But let not my will, but thine be done. So that's the third. That's the playing of the game of chess. So detachment, loving each other, and humility, these are the key things in that life of prayer, which is that relationship that we have with the Lord. So we'll leave for now, we've got a few minutes. Just take 2 or 3 minutes to talk to each other about your response to that.